With just how much recent years have been dominated by expensive and destructive kinetic conflicts, there's arguably something a bit refreshing about a good old-fashioned space race. With the Artemis II mission successfully splashing back to Earth, marking the first time since the 1970s that astronauts have made it out to the moon and returned safely. And while that was a headline-grabbing achievement, I thought it was also the perfect time to talk about the next potential frontier in space-based competition. In my previous 2 videos on space, we focused on Earth's orbit, both in terms of what space can do for you, satellites and their impact on the economy and military operations, and what international militaries can do to space, the domain of anti-satellite weapons. Increasingly though, countries are ambitiously looking further out, and they're shooting for the moon. With the US and China both planning a series of missions intended not just to put astronauts back on the moon, but for the first time in human history, potentially building permanent bases there, and tapping into space-based resources to support operations not just on the moon, but potentially also further beyond. And so today in the next episode in our space series, let's talk about competition beyond Earth's orbit, all the way out to the moon. To do that, we'll start by discussing how competition across domains in different technology areas tends to develop, from the curiosity and exploration stage to the point where economic and military imperatives start to sneak in, and apply that to some of what we've seen so far in terms of cislunar space and lunar exploration. We'll talk about the US-led Artemis effort and some international programs like China's that apparently plan to put bases on the moon as early as the 2030s, and how those efforts potentially link to another strategic elephant in the room, countries potentially drawing on space-based resources in order to support further space operations. Because after all, if you could locally produce oxygen or rocket fuel on the moon rather than having to lift it all from Earth, suddenly the logistics of pushing out further into the solar system might not look quite so oppressive. Finally, we'll look at some of the many technological risks and barriers that remain in the way, and what this potentially means for military space forces, who may not be leading the pathway back to the moon, but are certainly paying very close attention to it. So let's start with the question of space as a domain of competition, and the basic question of why. Why would countries invest so heavily in trying to push back towards the moon? And why would a channel normally focused on defence economics and military and economic competition choose to focus on somewhere like cislunar space, where the economic and military payoff might not be immediately obvious? One observation I'd make is that as humanity has developed and our technology has advanced, what we've often seen is that the domains of economic and military competition can evolve over time. In the very beginning, that meant land and pretty much just land. Ugg was probably more worried about the state of his cave and control of nearby hunting grounds, not whether or not the nearby Neanderthals were going to launch a cyber attack or obtain air superiority. As a species, our first steps into a new technology or domain then can often be guided by things like raw curiosity or prestige rather than immediate economic or military payoff, with a very rough progression, if you like, being from curiosity to commerce and or competition. When the Wright brothers pulled us into the domain of sustained heavier-than-air flights, they didn't do it with a design that had a huge amount of economic or military utility. There's only so much you can do with a design that packed 12 horsepower, managed a grand total of 4 flights before being wrecked, and maxed out at a 260-metre hop. Similarly, if you looked at the Soviet launch of Sputnik as a standalone program, you'd have to write an investment case justifying investing enormous resources in everything from rocketry to ground infrastructure in order to ultimately basically throw a metal ball into orbit that went beep periodically. Here's a slice of the original recording. And after making those transmissions, it would eventually burn up in Earth's atmosphere. Suffice to say that especially in the early stages of development, cost and capability don't tend to line up particularly well. The same holds true for a whole suite of military technologies where often an idea will emerge and resources be invested before the underlying concepts and technologies have been evolved enough to actually produce something good enough to be useful. Eventually, though, that technological development can happen, often building on that first stage of more exploratory investment. And as that happens sometimes quite quickly, a domain can move from being a curiosity to useful and potentially competitive. If you've done the difficult and expensive part of trying to figure out how to launch a metal ball into orbit, for example, it's then much less of an increment to figure out how to put a couple of cameras on the thing, and suddenly the space domain is in the ISR business. Remember, the Soviets launched Sputnik in late 1957. In June 1959, America was lobbing its first KH-1 Corona spy satellite into Earth orbit. And once developments like that start to give a domain economic or military utility, the incentives will often push planners towards the next step. If a domain is useful, they might ask, how can we potentially compete for or contest it? Hence potentially drawing a development line from things like useful satellites to the first anti-satellite weapons. I'd argue we saw this development play out at rapid pace in the 20th century, specifically looking at the air domain. Just over 40 years separated those first cautious hops in the United States to the globe-spanning contest for air superiority we saw in World War II, where it was significant chunks of entire economies, not a couple of guys in a bike shed, dedicated to turning out more advanced aircraft as rapidly as possible. The cyber domain is arguably another more recent example. Computers and networks are no longer niche tools, they're foundational to the entire global economy. And with that development has come the imperative to compete, contest, and if necessary, defend. The question there is, where is space as a domain on that journey compared to more traditional ones like cyber, air, land and sea? I'd suggest that for much of the Cold War space race, a lot of the initiatives we saw from both the Soviets and the United States were very much more on the prestige rather than practical side. The Soviets didn't gain any magic military advantage by slinging the likes of Gagarin or Tereshkova into space around the Earth, and it was both resource intensive and politically risky because of the danger of something going wrong in order to choose to do it. But in the context of Cold War competition, it was done anyway. From a soft power perspective, the payoff of doing that was arguably immense. As one US document from the 1960s put it, quote, "The political implications of our failure to be first in space are a matter of public record. The failure has reflected adversely on the United States scientific and political leadership." But beyond just providing the national equivalent of bragging rights, from a technical perspective, you could argue expensive symbolic developments can often help provide the base of technological and industrial capability and experience necessary to then transition to more practical activities, aka you don't get to Starlink without Sputnik. As I covered in the 2 previous episodes on my space series though, parts of space at least have made that transition from prestige to practical. Earth orbit is no longer a curiosity, it's indispensable. Our navigation systems rely on satellites. Many of our communication systems rely on satellites. We map the Earth, we monitor natural disasters, and militaries increasingly rely on space-based assets for their communications and ISR. As you can see on that chart there then, the amount of stuff that humanity is launching into Earth's orbit has absolutely exploded since the mid-2010s. As launch costs have come down, satellite technologies have improved, low Earth orbit constellations have started to proliferate, and more nations have joined the club of those with at least some anti-satellite capabilities. Because as much as warfare has changed over the years, there is a maxim that still holds true. As Sun Tzu said, when the enemy occupies the high ground, do not confront him, and if he attacks downhill, do not oppose him. And with the greatest respect to your average terrestrial hill or mountain, low Earth orbit is some very, very high ground. But while Earth orbit itself has obviously made that transition to being very practically valuable, you go out a bit further and start talking about cislunar space, and after a surge in early development and a lot of investment during the Cold War, the jump was never really made. Putting people on the moon was obviously deeply prestigious, but it didn't have the same kind of practical value as lobbing another communication satellite into orbit. And so unlike Earth orbital development, which has been a bit of an ongoing effort, our focus for today, lunar, followed a bit of a different track. And to explain what I mean there, we have to go back to the Cold War for a moment. Now, there's no hard and fast rulebook for a lunar program, but practically speaking, you might want to measure different countries against a set of milestones, if you like, that vary greatly in their technical complexity. To oversimplify, first you might want to test your ability to just get there. This is the likes of flyby, orbit, and impact missions. A flyby is just what it sounds like and might get you a little bit of useful information. The Soviets managed that with the launch of Luna 1 in January 1959, with the US following about 2 months later with Pioneer 4. Then there are impact missions, which require you actually being able to hit the thing. Luna 2 gathered a slew of useful scientific data on its way to slam into the moon in 1959, while the US would manage its own celestial headbutt with Ranger 4 in 1962. Much closer in terms of timeline, though, was to actually get to orbit the moon. The Soviets' Luna 10 would be the first spacecraft to actually orbit the moon in April 1966, while the US Lunar Orbiter 1 would make it there in August. I need to stress, though, despite these being very old milestones at this point, they're only old if you focus on what were at that point the only 2 real players in the game. The US and Soviets might have been in the business of doing this kind of stuff in the 50s and 60s, but after that there is a long, long gap until you get to the likes of Japan in the 90s. There's a similar gap when you talk about the milestone of pulling off a soft landing. Think of this kind of like the impact test, but you land at less catastrophic velocity. Potentially, obviously, very useful if you'd like to deliver things like scientific instruments or people that obviously don't tend to fare particularly well in hypersonic lithobraking scenarios. The Soviets landed Luna 9 in January 1966. You can see one of the images taken by it on the right there, followed by the US Surveyor 1 in May that same year. The next mission to make that milestone being the Chinese Chang'e 3 in 2013. So cool, you can now get to the moon and land something on it non-catastrophically. Next question, can you get back again? This is what you might call the sample return milestone, and it's useful if you want to, for example, get a sample of lunar material back to Earth in order to examine it more closely. The Soviets did this in an unmanned fashion with Luna 16 in 1970, Beijing with Chang'e 5 in 2020. But as you all probably know, the US skipped the whole automated return part and took a bit of a different tack, with the Apollo missions eventually landing astronauts and later astronauts and a rover, because even the logistics of space travel aren't enough to keep American car culture down, and managed to chalk up both the sample return milestone and the manned landing milestone in 1969, a feat which, to this day, no other country has accomplished. After the race to the moon, though, things started to really tail off. The US had scored the prestige win with the likes of Apollo 11, but after Apollo 17, and with no obvious response from the Soviets, the program was wound up. The Soviet space program would obviously later face even greater issues on account of the Soviet Union not existing anymore, which robbed the US of its primary pacing competitor and much incentive to keep going back to Luna, with this chart, I think, showing the sheer scale of the rise and fall in lunar missions. In the 1950s, there were a combined 13 US and Soviet launches to the moon. In the 1960s, 63, more than would collectively take place in the next half century. The 1970s saw 23 launches, the 1980s, 0, and the figure wouldn't creep into the double digits again until the 2010s. And when the mission cadence started to pick up again, notably a lot of the activity wasn't driven by Moscow or Washington. It was comparatively newer entrants to cislunar space that started to steadily check off some of those old milestones the US and Soviets had previously hit. The People's Republic of China, for example, became the third country to return samples from the moon in 2020 using Chang'e 5. That followed orbital missions in 2007 and 2010 and soft landings in 2013 and 19. India deployed a rover of its own for the first time in 2023, landing near the moon's south pole, while Japan became country number 5 to manage a soft landing later that same year. And across all these missions, humanity was steadily learning a little bit more about Luna. The Indian probe Chandrayaan-1, for example, comes to mind as a good example. It was an orbital mission that, among other things, managed to provide direct evidence of water on the moon. And a number of subsequent and planned missions by various states have focused on trying to understand just how much of the all-important H2O might be up there and how it's potentially distributed. And as other countries were starting to launch towards the moon with greater frequency, the old incumbents seemed to be taking a bit more of an interest as well. For the Russians, that meant a variety of announced and totally realistic plans to launch multiple missions back to Luna, with Moscow even deciding to keep the original lunar numbering series used by the Soviets, announcing missions Luna 28, 29 and 30 for the 2032 to 2036 period. Meanwhile, back in the United States, let's talk Artemis. Right up front, there's a few things to say about this renewed NASA push to the moon. The first is, just like Apollo, Artemis isn't a mission, it's a program. And just as Apollo steadily graduated from the likes of flybys and orbits to the eventual landing and rover expeditions, Artemis is also meant to follow a progression. That might help explain another incentive that can encourage nations to spend money on space exploration efforts even before they can identify a hard net economic, scientific or strategic benefit. Building up the industrial, scientific, technological and employee base necessary to compete and lead in a new technology or domain can take time. In the case of something as complex as space, potentially lots and lots of time. And so if you wait until the technology has matured enough that the potential benefit is clear, you run the risk of being well behind when you finally decide you have to compete. Likewise, as we've seen in so many industries, with plenty of defence examples covered on the channel, if you stop funding a particular activity, relatively quickly, your capacity there might atrophy away. If Roscosmos isn't hiring staff or paying its suppliers, then all those highly qualified personnel aren't going to keep working for exposure. Younger employees aren't going to come through the door and get the experience they need to be the leaders in the future. That means countries looking at their space programs might have to ask not just whether they need certain capabilities now, but whether they're going to need to have them in 10 to 15 years. And if so, what is it going to take to build and maintain them until then? Because the alternative, as we've seen with NASA planning to go back to the moon, is you might have to invest significant resources and time, at first in a sense retreading old territory, and then setting the stage to go further. As NASA puts it, quotes, under Artemis, NASA will send astronauts on increasingly difficult missions to explore more of the moon for scientific discovery, economic benefits, and to build the foundation for our first crewed missions to Mars, end quote. Meaning this very much isn't meant to be just about refreshing the Neil Armstrong experience. There's meant to be a broader economic and exploration agenda here. The other thing to flag, which I think is sometimes missed in the media, is that while this is a NASA-led program, it's really a multinational effort. Artemis's service module, for example, that provided the spacecraft with electricity, water, oxygen, nitrogen, and which included the propulsion system intended to navigate the spacecraft while in space, was actually built by the European Space Agency, with the acronym ESM standing for European Service Module. It built on the experience the ESA had previously gained with its automated transfer vehicle, 5 of which had been used to deliver supplies to the ISS. Likewise, the crew of the recent mission was also multinational. Commander Reed Wiseman, pilot Victor Glover, and mission specialist Christina Cook were all Americans. But the crew's second mission specialist, Jeremy Hansen, was the Canadian of the bunch, making Hansen the first non-American to leave Earth's orbit and fly out to the moon. Also, if you ever want to feel good about your professional achievements in life, I do have one strong piece of advice. Never, ever read the CVs of astronauts. It's the nature of the job to often select down to people who sound like they got to cheat at character creation. But given how dangerous operations in space can be, and the fact that NASA's only selected about 370 astronauts since its inception, perhaps that's not surprising. I believe the only member of the crew without at least a master's degree was this bloke here, the appropriately named Rise, whose job was to be the crew's zero-gravity indicator. We'll go through the forward Artemis plan in a moment, but it's worth highlighting there are international dependencies running through all of it. Future plans, for example, involve a pressurised lunar rover, the Lunar Cruiser, something that, unlike the open buggy designs in the past, would enable astronauts to operate it without wearing spacesuits. That lunar cruiser is meant to be provided by Japan in exchange for 2 Japanese astronauts being carried to the lunar surface on future Artemis missions. And perhaps because reliability might be a slight concern when you're driving a vehicle 200,000 miles from the nearest repair shop, apparently the plan is for these astronauts of the future to cruise around the lunar surface in a Toyota. The core point here is that while I'm about to go through the stated American plan, it is a plan with a lot of dependencies. It relies on technologies and contributions from allied countries, and it requires NASA being able to hold off one of the great historical threats to any space exploration initiative: budget fights. When it comes to space exploration, like anything, stable funding is not a safe assumption. And even as Artemis was splashing back to Earth, reporting was the US Congress was set to debate a new NASA budget, about $5.5 billion less than the previous year. Budget dynamics are relevant here because they might provide incentives for successful, high-profile missions, even if they don't have immediate strategic payoff. In part because, the thinking might go, if you can maintain public attention and boost political support, earlier missions might help provide not just the technical lessons that help you take the next step, but also the political capital to keep the lights on long enough to get there. Which gets us to the genesis of some of NASA's more recent space efforts and Artemis. In terms of long-term goals, I'd go back at least as far as the NASA Appropriation Act of 2010. That established a long-term statutory goal of expanding permanent human presence beyond low Earth orbit, and it mandated the development of a couple of systems that we're seeing in use now. A, by historical standards, relatively large cruise module, now known as Orion, for between 4 and 6 astronauts, remembering Apollo 11 carried a grand total of 3, only 2 of which actually landed on the lunar surface, and also a super heavy rocket, the Space Launch System, or SLS, with the intention being that SLS would be upgraded in stages and also potentially used for other missions involving either very heavy payloads or requiring very high levels of thrust. Now, as fun as it might be, this is not a procurement disaster video. The focus is more on the missions and competition out past Earth's orbit as opposed to the amount of money being burned to get there. But for the sake of completeness and in a potential preview of some future content, you can't entirely gloss over the story of SLS, its engines, and the supporting infrastructure. What you can see on the right there is a 2023 report by the Inspector General on NASA's management of the SLS booster and engine contracts. Despite being a modern system, SLS repurposes technology from the Space Shuttle era, including the RS-25 rocket engine. Normally that kind of approach might be associated with reducing risk and limiting the possibility of delays and cost overruns. Usually, as the report put it at the time, quote, NASA continues to experience significant scope growth, cost increases and schedule delays on its booster and RS-25 engine contracts, resulting in approximately $6 billion in cost increases over 6 years in schedule delays above NASA's original projections. These increases are caused by long-standing, interrelated issues such as the assumption that the use of heritage technologies from the Space Shuttle and Constellation programs were expected to result in significant cost and schedule savings compared to developing new systems for the SLS. However, and here's the kicker, the complexity of developing, updating and integrating new systems along with their heritage components proved to be much greater than anticipated, resulting in the completion of only 5 of 16 engines under the adaptation contract and added scope and cost increases to the booster contract. End quote. So yeah, as many other programs have shown, sometimes trying to reuse old designs or leverage existing assets isn't necessarily a guarantee of a cheap, quick or risk-free program. Oh, and as for the performance rating systems on those contracts, the report suggests that one contractor, received a very good performance rating despite only finishing 5 of the 16 planned engines. Another absolute highlight of the whole endeavour has been NASA's planned new mobile launch tower for the SLS. Like many of the more interesting decisions NASA has taken, this one was expressly directed by the US Congress. NASA obviously already has a launcher, but a contract for a second larger one capable of supporting larger versions of SLS was originally awarded in June 2019, the original schedule for delivery, March 2023. According to another Inspector General's report, this time from August 2024, by December 2023, NASA's estimated all-up cost had increased slightly from the original $500 million to about $1.5 billion, with the report suggesting a possibility cost could climb as high as $2.7 billion, and despite the original 2023 deadline, might not be ready to support a launch in spring 2029. So, yeah, there are perhaps a couple of stories here that we might want to unpick in the future. But of course, none of that was enough to stop NASA's efforts rolling forward, which gets us to the opening missions in the Artemis series. Artemis I launched in November 2022 and was basically an unmanned test run. The SLS was used to launch Orion, enabling a flyby in orbit of the Moon, and then an eventual Orion return to Earth. The testing process did help surface some issues, which were probably better experienced by the 3 mannequins on board than actual humans, with damage to the heat shield in particular drawing a lot of attention, leading to the following manned Artemis II mission adopting a different re-entry trajectory. Artemis II was meant to dial up the complexity by introducing the crew component, but without going so far as actually trying to land on the Moon. Instead, as you can see on screen, this was a lunar flyby mission, taking the crew out further away from Earth than any other human before them. And once again, because when it comes to spaceflight, simple is often difficult and nothing is non-critical, the flight did help surface a couple of issues that might be better dealt with now than during an attempted landing mission. Some of these were at least somewhat known and understood before the mission was actually launched, while others are the kind of things that might not surface in an uncrewed mission. Much reported issues with the waste management system, for example, are probably of much more concern to a human crew. Less reported helium leaks, for example, reportedly posed no risk to the Artemis II mission, but will nonetheless probably require some design adjustments before Orion is sent out to carry astronauts to the surface of the Moon. It's also worth noting that with almost any system, tests can be useful to identify not just things that don't work, but also highlight things that do. In some technical respects, the mission appears to have gone bloody well, with NASA reportedly able to actually skip some of the planned course correction burns, because the mission was already on close enough to a perfect course. In the end, though, from a programmatic perspective, as impressive as it was, Artemis II was really a bit of a glorified multi-billion-dollar test drive to help NASA get closer to one of the next major milestones, repeating the achievement of the late 1960s and putting astronauts back on the lunar surface. Just like getting crew physically back to the Moon, that requires developing a modern technical solution to a previously solved problem. The successor to the lunar landers of old is meant to be the HLS, the Human Landing System, which NASA wanted in at least 2 versions. One for carrying human crew down to the surface, and another for cargo deliveries. The role of Artemis III, officially scheduled for 2027, is meant to be to test the operation of Orion, which just flew with Artemis II, with one or both of the HLS landers, with NASA essentially hedging its bets by handing contracts to both SpaceX and Blue Origin to independently design their own landers. That would carry the program along its maturity journey, to the point where eventually you could have a manned Artemis mission putting people back on the Moon, officially scheduled, for reasons I'm sure have nothing to do with the US electoral calendar, to take place by the end of 2028. There is, however, it must be said, at least one small risk with that proposed schedule. The HLS, at least as required, doesn't currently exist. Among other potential issues, the SpaceX proposal for the HLS relies on the Starship launch vehicle. And while, as I've said in the past, that's a very promising system in terms of paper statistics, its recent tests have still shown it to have a bit of an exploding issue, a characteristic generally not preferred in rockets, especially when it comes to manned missions. Starship's proposed lander is also, by historical standards, an absolute chonker. It reportedly stands more than 50 metres tall, and its proposed mission profile requires launching the thing, then refueling it in Earth's orbit, before it transfers over to the Moon to do its job as a lander. Blue Origin's proposed landers are somewhat less ambitious, but also face their own suite of unknowns and uncertainties. So whether NASA is actually ready for a test flight in 2027 and an actual mission to the Moon in 2028, only time will tell, but given that we're now in April 2026, the clock is definitely ticking. And it's worth noting that even the current timeline represents a significant slip from the stated ambition even just a couple of years ago. The version of the Artemis plan released in 2020 actually called for even more aggressive timelines, including a crewed mission to the lunar surface not in 2028, but in 2024. The basic point being that when it comes to programs like this, timelines are seldom set in stone. something which will become a bit more relevant when we talk about some of the timelines being targeted by other countries a bit later on. Even once Artemis IV eventually lands though, you could argue it really only gets the space exploration milestones back to where they were in 1969. The more interesting aspect from the point of view of a channel like this one is what's meant to happen next, because the stated goal this time isn't so much just to get to the moon, it's to stay there. Originally, one of the next stages of the plan, launching no earlier than 2027, was to launch a multinational lunar space station. This is Gateway, and it was meant to create a small persistent presence in orbit of the moon that could support things like scientific research or lunar operations. As at time of recording, a lot of progress had reportedly been made on some critical modules for Gateway. And yet, I still think we can be fairly confident it won't be launching in 2027, because it was recently announced the plan for the Gateway station was going to be scrapped, and insofar as possible, its technology and modules repurposed to support another, more ambitious mission. A $20 billion plan to build a base on the lunar surface over the course of the next 7 years. Get into the NASA slide deck on the moon base plan, and you'll see the next 4 years from 2033 to 2036 inclusive are meant to add at least $10 billion more to that figure, presumably before you factor in any delays and cost overruns. Announcing the sweeping change in plan, NASA Administrator Jarek Isaacman partly framed the decision in terms of great power competition. NASA, he seemed to suggest, needed to succeed here or it would cede the moon to China. Note, China had already announced plans to build a base on the moon years ago. Beijing and Moscow signed a memorandum of understanding back in 2021 on the establishment of a lunar research station in the moon's South Pole region, with the stated aim of construction being completed by 2035. In subsequent years, multiple other nations signed on to the program, although with such known space superpowers like Belarus, Senegal and Nicaragua in the lineup, it was very much still meant to be Roscosmos and CNSA doing the heavy lifting. The stated US plan operates on similar timelines, but at a different scale. According to NASA, Phase 1, running from 2026 through 2028, is meant to include a casual 24 launches to the moon, delivering about 4 tons of payload, something described as a very challenging timeline and coming with an approximate $10 billion price tag. This is very much meant to be the build, test and learn phase, where various new systems like drones or lunar vehicles can be deployed and tested for the first time. NASA's release materials suggest that might include things like limited mobility tools and drones, a light lunar rover, the Lunar Terrain Vehicle, capable of maxing out at about 10 kilometers an hour, light lunar drones capable of making short propulsive hops to survey harder-to-reach terrain, and setting up better communications, because apparently even the moon needs better connectivity than parts of Australia. Then in Phase 2, nominally 2029 through 2032, the mission shifts to infrastructure. Unlike Phase 1 with its 4-ton payload requirement, Phase 2 would call for no less than 60 tons, along with another 27 launches, multiple crewed missions, and building out hundreds of watts worth of power generation capability on the lunar surface using RTGs, radiothermal generators. As NASA seems to describe it, you can think of this phase as essentially preparing the ground for what comes next, as well as rovers deployed, as you can see on screen there, to quote, enable site preparation, regolith manipulation, and initial logistics capabilities, end quote. And it's only once some of that preparation has been done that the document suggests NASA would be willing to move on to Stage 3. That stage, meant to run 2033 to 2036, raises the payload requirement to 150 tons, with the goal being to actually establish habitable volumes on the lunar surface capable of supporting a small continuous human presence. NASA's published plan for that stage again relies on drawing on technologies from international partners, including multi-purpose habitats from the Italian Space Agency and utility vehicles sourced from the Canadians, with some of the features you can see identified here, including not just the habitats themselves, but also cargo return capabilities, in-situ resource utilisation, and potentially nuclear fission power generation. So suffice to say, a very, very ambitious shopping list, especially given the suggested timeline. The question you might be asking here, as the costs and payload requirements mount, is basically why? Why go through the much more expensive process of trying to establish a presence on the surface, rather than just taking the much less technically challenging option of slinging a station into lunar orbit? As the former head of the Gateway program, now leader of the Moon Base Initiative, reportedly put it, quote, while I do believe an orbital outpost has value in our overall exploration goals, that doesn't mean we can't do it later. We need to be focused on the surface, and everyone wants to be on the surface, end quote. And while there's probably a lot sitting behind that statement, one of the key things that differentiates the surface from orbit is the presence of natural resources that a base could potentially use. And you will find document after document talking about an imperative to develop and use lunar resources. Now keep in mind that generally when people talk about space resources, Often it has to do with two, I'd argue, very different propositions. Firstly, there are those proposals that call for going out to space, finding valuable resources, say a metal-rich asteroid, for example, extracting those resources and bringing them back to support the Earth market. This is, to put it simply, a tad economically complicated, because you need that hypothetical process to be economically competitive with just extracting those resources on Earth instead, and also account for the fact that if you do start bringing back massive amounts of valuable material, then the market being the market, the value of that material is obviously going to drop. Given that, let's leave the likes of asteroid mining out of scope today, and instead focus on concepts where you're extracting resources in space to support operations in space. This is the world of ISRU, in situ resource utilisation. As NASA puts it, quote, "The further humans go into deep space, the more important it will be to generate products with local materials, a practice called in situ resource utilisation. From a basic physics perspective, the logic here is relatively simple. Courtesy of gravity in our atmosphere, lifting stuff from Earth's surface is an energy-intensive exercise. And as much as launch costs have come down and rocketry technology has improved, every kilogram you want to lift into orbit is going to cost you, and every kilogram you want to get safely to the surface of the moon at a survivable velocity, even more so. Lifting stuff from Earth also imposes a time delay and relies on whatever launch cadence you're able to maintain. If for whatever reason you can't launch as scheduled or have to divert rockets for other missions, then those supplies are just going to have to wait. That makes the idea of potentially utilising things from the local environment very attractive. NASA has explicitly set out some of its intentions for lunar ISRU. That includes experimentation and demos during Phase 1 and 2, while in Phase 3, the goal is to move on to implementation. Some of the commodities identified for potential use include the regular suspects, water, oxygen, hydrogen, but as you can see on screen there's also explicit mention of this idea of taking lunar regolith and using various processes to convert that into useful materials for things like construction. Perhaps not easy, simply, or cheaply, but when it comes to space exploration, nothing really ever is. The prospect of ISRU is one of the reasons why the discovery of any water ice on the moon was such an exciting prospect. That naturally raises a question though. If potentially there are useful resources out there, some potentially as nearby as the lunar surface, who potentially owns them or gets to use them? On Earth's surface, questions of resource ownership have long-established answers in international law. In space, things work a bit differently. Because while the US has employed the time-honoured tradition of landing a person somewhere and planting a flag, from a legal perspective that really only translates into bragging rights, not sovereignty. In the early stages of the Cold War, there wasn't really any legal framework about what countries could or couldn't do on the moon. The US Army, for example, ran a feasibility study into establishing a permanent military base on the moon before the end of the 1960s, Project Horizon, with one of the arguments being that if the United States didn't do it first, the Soviets may, quote, claim the moon or critical areas thereof for its own. Then a subsequent attempt to establish any outpost by the United States might be considered and propagandized as a hostile act, end quote. Basically, the age-old argument if we don't, someone else might. And to be fair, even in more modern times, we have seen some Russian discussion of the concept of lunar sovereignty. The article on the right there, for example, covers a proposal by the Vice President of the Russian Academy of Sciences to essentially divide up the moon so Russia got sovereign territory there. Whether or not that's meant to take place before or after the lunar population vote unanimously in a referendum to join the Russian Federation wasn't mentioned. But more importantly, within the bounds of current international law, it's also just not legal. The key is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, or more fully, the Treaty on Principles Governing the Activity of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies. This agreement, reached in 1966, despite the superpowers pointing an array of nuclear weapons at each other at the time, basically decided to take the mess of military competition that was taking place on Earth and leave space out of it. It established a couple of core principles, that the exploration of outer space should be carried out for the benefit and interest of all countries and all mankind, that outer space would be free and open for exploration and use by all states, that no one would deploy nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction into space, that the moon shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes, and critically, that outer space would not be subject to national appropriation or claims of sovereignty. In other words, the vast majority of countries around the world, including the US and Soviet Union, agreed that space belonged to everyone, and as a result, it couldn't be owned by anyone. There were also more efforts during the Cold War to establish additional rules around space and its resources, but most of those, unlike the Outer Space Treaty, weren't successful. In the 70s, for example, 8 equatorial countries signed a declaration attempting to assert sovereignty over the valuable portions of geostationary orbit that lie continuously above their territory. This didn't really go anywhere though, in part because, shockingly enough, non-equatorial countries weren't especially keen to sign on. No country actually active in space recognised these claims of sovereignty, and as a result they were largely abandoned. More interesting from a resource perspective though was the attempt to establish the so-called Moon Treaty in the 1980s. Among other things, this would have established an international regime for regulating the extraction of resources on the moon, and also required a, quote, equitable sharing by all straight parties in the benefits derived from those resources, end quote. Basically suggesting that countries doing resource extraction would have to share the benefit with countries that potentially weren't, which, as you can imagine, was the kind of rare proposal that was able to unite Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. The vast majority of space-going states refused to sign on, leaving the proposal with little effect, meaning the key document for the rule set remained that 1967 treaty, and giving the space-going powers a bit of freedom in how they chose to interpret it. Some of those have expressly pushed ahead with establishing their own domestic legal rules covering space resource extraction. The US, for example, passed the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act back in 2015. That explicitly stated the US wasn't asserting sovereignty or exclusive rights to any celestial body, but it did permit US industry to go out and engage in space exploration and extract space resources, basically towing the line that if no one owns it, anyone can mine it. The US is hardly alone in that kind of approach. Even Luxembourg established a space law back in 2016, which explicitly provided for the right of private companies working in space to extract resources there. And in the absence of a new binding international framework, we've seen non-binding multilateral ones spring up. The big example here would probably be the US-led Artemis Accords, and given it's been signed, I believe, by more than 60 countries, notably including India but excluding Russia and China, it probably gives us a fairly strong indication of how at least parts of the world have decided they're going to treat space resources and claims going forward. On resources, it says that extraction and utilisation of space resources should be in support of safe and sustainable space activities, and that signatories should inform the UN, the public, and the international scientific community of their space resource extraction activities. But it explicitly says that extracting resources doesn't constitute a claim of sovereignty or national appropriation, and as a result doesn't breach the Outer Space Treaty, thus building this idea that just because you can't make Luna the 51st state of the US or the newest member of the European Union, that doesn't mean you're not able to mine there, which you could argue de facto makes the guiding legal principle for who gets to extract and utilise space resources the ancient maxim of first come, first served. Perhaps even more so when you're talking about relations between different members of the Accords, because while it doesn't allow nations to claim sovereignty, it does allow them to establish temporary security zones around any of their ongoing operations, noting that in the case of a permanent or semi-permanent base, a temporary zone might not be overly temporary. If you assume nations are going to follow something like that kind of rule set, then it does arguably provide at least some incentive for countries to try and be near the head of the pack. Even if there are multiple potential landing sites and resource deposits, going first might provide you the greatest opportunity to take your pick. And I think it's fairly notable that multiple countries, including the United States and China, have both shown considerable interest in, and put resources behind, developing the kind of technologies and systems you might need to locate, extract, refine, and utilise lunar resources. Speaking of which, what about some of those other programs and efforts? Because while the recent focus, quite rightly, has been on the success of Artemis II, when it comes to lunar missions, NASA is very much not the only player in the game. In fact, arguably, the moon's more popular than it's been in decades, with plenty of countries publishing, in some cases, quite ambitious mission plans. Back in 2023, for example, the Indian government announced plans to build an Earth-orbiting space station in the 2030s and to land astronauts on the lunar surface by 2040. Russia attempted to go back to the moon with the Luna 25 lander back in 2023, and to be fair, they did get the lander there, just rather more quickly than originally intended. After a failed orbital manoeuvre, the lander crashed into the moon on the 19th of August 2023. Officially, Russia does have some ambitious future moon missions planned, including an unmanned lander mission targeting the ever-popular lunar southern pole, meant to investigate those same lunar resources that have a lot of other countries paying attention as well. I'd suggest the fundamental challenge Russia faces with its future moon exploration programs, though, is one that will be very familiar to those of you who watch this channel. The war in Ukraine has both diverted massive amounts of Russian space resources, while also forcing Russian enterprises like Roscosmos to operate under international sanctions. This doesn't just make it harder for Russia to fund and run missions itself, it cuts off some of the previous cooperation options that the Russians were originally counting on. Before the invasion of Ukraine, for example, there was significant planned cooperation between Roscosmos and the European Space Agency. One planned mission, for example, called for the combination of an ESA-built Mars rover with a Russian-supplied lander, something which would have arguably gotten Russia more into the Mars exploration game, but was shelved following the invasion. Luna 27 was meant to integrate various European components, and that now presumably won't happen. Russia obviously still has some advantages in terms of its ability to operate in space, largely built on the continuation of that old Soviet scientific and industrial legacy. But in the current context, it's just hard to see them having the resources necessary to potentially keep up with the likes of NASA. Instead, US leaders now tend to point to Beijing as the key pacing competitor in space. And if you look at just how quickly the Chinese space program and launch volumes have evolved, you can potentially see the point. Now, to be fair, the Chinese government does tend to explicitly avoid the terminology of a space race. And late last year, we saw a foreign ministry representative reportedly say that, quote, China has no intention to engage in a space race with any country, end quote. But whatever language is used to couch China's space development, the pace of it has certainly been enough to draw global attention. In 2003, China became the third nation ever to demonstrate independent human spaceflight capability after the Soviet Union and United States with Shenzhou 5. As we covered earlier, they pushed through the regular lunar exploration milestones and also racked up one or two new ones, for example becoming the first country ever to return samples from the far side of the moon. In 2022, the Tiangong space station in Earth orbit became operational, and the stated plan now is for a crewed landing on the lunar surface by 2030. That, of course, technically puts them behind the planned Artemis schedule, but that's assuming that both the US and Chinese missions hit their planned launch dates. What's more certain than the exact timeline is that Beijing's been moving to bring together all the pieces you'd need for this kind of mission. The launch vehicle is likely to be the Long March 10, reportedly optimised to get about 27 tonnes worth of payload into a translunar orbit, and then you have Beijing's equivalent to Orion and also their lunar lander. With an interesting observation in both cases, the Chinese appear to have gone smaller and lighter than the Americans. Mengzhou is essentially China's Orion equivalent. It reportedly completed an unmanned atmospheric safety test earlier this year and is expected to receive a crew rating in 2027 or 28. Compared to the roomier Orion, the plan here appears to be only 3 crew to the moon plus cargo, which arguably makes sense because China's proposed lunar lander is much closer in size once everything has been jettisoned, the American lunar landers of the 1960s and 70s, than it is to something like the proposed lunar high-rise that is the SpaceX HLS. That form factor obviously might impose limitations on mission planners, but it also allows Beijing to potentially skip steps, like the proposed Starship orbital refueling process. A Chinese lunar landing mission could be accomplished with 2 Long March 10 launches, the first sending the lunar lander, at that point uncrewed, out to lunar orbit, followed by a second Long March 10 carrying the crew in their module, with them rendezvousing at the lander once they made it into lunar orbit. Like the United States though, China apparently has no intention to stop with just putting astronauts on the moon's surface. According to the chief designer of China's lunar exploration program, the plan is to build a basic lunar research station by 2035, including both a comprehensive scientific facility and a, quote, certain scale of resource development and utilisation, end quote. At other stages, it's been suggested that China would try and build a lunar orbital station by 2045 that could be used to carry out, quote, in-depth resource development and utilisation and relevant technical verification and scientific experimental research for manned landing on Mars, end quote. Suggesting that while there's differences in the timeline, both Washington and Beijing share a lot of the same ambitions. Put boots on the lunar ground, build a base, try to start making use of some of the resources there, and in the longer term, cast the knife further out, towards Mars. And of course, sitting behind all this, given this is a defence economics channel, is how national militaries might eventually fit into this, for now, civilian-led picture. Because while courtesy of the Outer Space Treaty, we might think of space beyond Earth's orbit now as essentially demilitarised ground, it wasn't always that way, and there's no guarantee it stays that way. Before the Outer Space Treaty, both the Soviet and US militaries were looking at cislunar space. Some of their ideas might have been relatively grounded, others not so much. The US Army's Project Horizon study, for example, was arguably even more ambitious than some of what the US and China are planning now. A permanent manned presence on the moon, with US Army personnel living in buried tubes on the lunar surface, powered by nuclear reactors. Something the study concluded would be absolutely possible by the end of the 1960s, albeit very, very expensive. I'll actually include the originally secret document for Project Horizon in the description, because I think it provides an interesting insight into how parts of the military were looking at the potential of space and the lunar surface, even back in the 1960s. To give you just a few samples, it suggests that, quote, the employment of moon-based weapon systems against Earth or space targets may prove to be feasible and desirable. Moon-based military power will be a strong deterrent to war because the extreme difficulty from the enemy point of view of eliminating our ability to retaliate, which to me suggests the idea of putting nuclear deterrent systems on the moon, and it suggests a potential military first-mover advantage, with whoever arrived first potentially being in a much better position to counter attempted landings by other countries. It also, interestingly enough, given the present discussion, raised the prospect of using lunar resources, saying, quote, "Perhaps the most promising scientific advantage is the usefulness of a moon base for further exploration into space. Materials on the moon itself may prove to be valuable and commercially exploitable," end quote. And in one additional bit of evidence that sometimes things never really change no matter how many decades pass, the document also featured a very optimistic timeline and an interesting evaluation of the technical risk involved, with the report suggesting that there are, quote, "no known technical barriers to the establishment of a manned installation on the moon," end quote. And while as far as I'm aware, nothing during the Cold War progressed much beyond the sketches on a page phase, the Army even gave some thought to the kind of personal weapons that troops might be able to carry on the moon, presumably just in case the Soviets decided to embrace the whole battle zone experience and somehow convert space warfare into line-of-sight infantry combat. How that was ever meant to happen, your guess is as good as mine, but since when has a lack of plausibility ever been enough to stop an interesting thought exercise? Now, thankfully, both due to the Outer Space Treaty and the truly bonkers amount of resources that would have been involved, all of these grandiose Cold War ideas of military operations in cislunar space were eventually shelved. But especially as missions ramp up again, that doesn't mean the military's been pushed out entirely. In December 2025, the White House issued an executive order titled Ensuring American Space Superiority. It indicated the US would pursue a space policy intended to extend the reach of human discovery, but also secure the nation's vital economic and security interests, unleash commercial development, and lay the foundations for a new space age. And in the list of specific directives, it included a push to be able to detect, characterise and counter threats to US space interest all the way out to the moon. We've heard US officials indicate publicly that they think Space Force needs to have cislunar capability. And speaking of lunar space, the top general in charge of Space Force has reportedly described it as, quote, "a location for potential military operations in the future." What that actually seems to mean in the near term is relatively limited. Things like being able to better track and categorise objects in cislunar space, and maintain an awareness of what other nations might be doing out there. As one US Space Force general reportedly put it back in 2024, quote, "We're not fighting over mineral deposits on an asteroid somewhere, we're not, right now, shepherding convoys to Mars." And for the most part, the military appears to be describing itself as very much a supporting actor for now. General Saltzman, the US Chief of Space Operations, has previously described Space Force as a first follower, not leading the effort, but very interested in how it's developing in order to avoid being put, as he described it, flat-footed. Quote, "I just don't want to get caught flat-footed when we start to have to protect US interests out there, so we're along for the ride." End quote. He also seemed to suggest that as to what US interests out at the moon actually were, things were still a bit uncertain. Quote, "Is it physical, meaning there's space on the moon that we have to protect? I don't know yet. I'm still waiting for that to unfold. That's why I say we're not leading the effort, but we do want to be involved." End quote. Those comments start to get backed about what I said about domain competition evolution right near the start of the episode. For there to be an incentive for military involvement, you'd expect there to have to be something to protect and a potential threat to protect against. At the moment, and for many years yet, those might not exist. But militaries are unlikely to want to assume that it's never going to happen. To once again quote Saltzman, "As US interests go farther and farther into space, there's going to be a need to protect and defend those interests. That's where we get involved. So we've got to pay attention early to exactly what is NASA going to do, how far are they going to go, and what is the PRC doing in cislunar space? What are their interests there?" End quote. The point is, at least for the moment, a lot of the competition between actors in cislunar space looks a lot like the first space race. The contest is one of science, engineering, and execution, where sure, states might have an incentive to move quickly and faster than their competitors if they can, but it's still overwhelmingly couched in terms of science, exploration, and peaceful purposes. What I think is important to remember, though, is nothing is guaranteed to stay that way. And if we do see, as agencies like the ESA are predicting, something like a lunar economy develop over time, it's entirely possible you could start to see national security interests following behind those scientific and economic ones. For the moment, though, those kind of concerns still thankfully seem a way off. And frankly, I suspect if we're talking about more realistic, short and medium-term threats to these expansive plans that countries have to send astronauts back to the moon and establish permanent or semi-permanent crewed bases there, the primary risk factors are probably going to be much more familiar. Technical challenges, budget overruns, time delays, and also, especially if you're talking about proposed crewed missions, competition with alternative mission plans that take out all or most of the human element. because it's often going to be just so much cheaper and easier to transport and sustain a robot in space that can exist primarily on a diet of electrical energy than it is one or more squishy humans who are designed for a very different operating environment. At the moment, many of the players in this space race who are pushing the boundaries appear to be keeping at least some of their goals very people-focused. But whether the scale of those ambitions expand or contract, especially as budgets and timelines begin to bite, as is so often the case, only time will tell. In any case, I think it's clear that after a long hiatus, the human race to the moon is back on again, this time with an intention not just to visit, but to start taking some first steps towards new milestones like ISRU. And from a scientific, engineering and industrial perspective, while we might not be able to be 100% sure what country will cross the finish line on any particular milestone first, I do think we can be fairly confident that it's going to be an interesting one to watch. And okay, channel update to close out. I've wanted to do this third episode in the space series for a long time. I'm aware that space isn't my individual area of expertise, and there are a lot of other creators out there that cover it in a lot more detail. But the potential strategic and defence economic significance of space operations is just so great that you really have to cover it. And I've been tempted to get the series going again for quite some time. But ultimately, I'm glad I waited until Artemis II to do it, and even more glad that it was as successful a mission as it was. Nothing when it comes to space travel is safe or easy. And so whenever we see any country launch a successful mission like that and get their astronauts home safely, I do think that's a bit of a moment worth recognising. Moving on, in terms of updates for the channel itself, there is one potential change that I wanted to preview. For years now, I've generally targeted a Sunday release cadence. Given the way my work was structured in 2022, that was the day that made the most sense. But if you jump forward to 2026, the day my average week is structured looks quite different now. And so to help make it a bit easier for me to balance things and reduce the odds of individual episodes being delayed, the goal moving forward is likely to be to try and start pulling releases back to Friday. I'm not sure exactly yet when I'll be able to make that jump, but if you do see an episode go up on a Friday, that's why. Other than that, as always, thank you to all of you for your ongoing engagement and support, and with any luck I'll see you soon as we turn our eyes back to Earth.